All right, we've got this breaking news just coming into our newsroom right now. The Supreme Court has issued a ruling.
The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
This is a case that's been bounced around back and forth throughout the court system.
When a state government passes legislation explicitly declaring it will no longer cooperate with federal law enforcement, you're watching either constitutional principle in action or the unraveling of the legal framework that holds the nation together, depending entirely on your perspective. Missouri did exactly that in 2021, and what followed wasn't just another routine legal challenge working its way through appellate courts. What followed was a collision between competing visions of American governance so fundamental that it forced the Supreme Court to make an emergency decision, and that decision came down 8-1 in a way that surprised almost everyone watching. Only Justice Clarence Thomas sided with Missouri's position, leaving the state standing virtually alone against the combined weight of the federal judiciary. But here's what makes this story genuinely fascinating rather than just another partisan legal battle. The court's decision wasn't actually a final ruling on whether Missouri's law is constitutional. It was a procedural move, a strategic pause that leaves the ultimate question unresolved while the case continues developing in lower courts. Understanding what really happened here requires looking past the headlines about defeat or victory and examining what Missouri attempted, why the federal government responded so aggressively, and what this entire confrontation reveals about the ongoing tension between state sovereignty and federal authority that's existed since the Constitution was ratified. Missouri's legislature passed the Second Amendment Preservation Act in 2021, and calling it bold would be a dramatic understatement. This wasn't symbolic legislation expressing disapproval of federal policies while leaving enforcement untouched. This was a direct legal challenge to federal supremacy on gun regulation, structured around several explosive provisions that immediately attracted national attention and controversy. The law declared that federal gun laws infringing on Second Amendment rights were invalid within Missouri's borders, not just unwise or inappropriate, but legally invalid. It prohibited state and local law enforcement from cooperating with federal agents attempting to enforce those federal gun restrictions. It created a private right of action allowing individual citizens to sue state officials who assisted federal enforcement efforts. The entire framework was built on the principle of state sovereignty, testing whether states could refuse to enforce what they consider unconstitutional federal mandates. Supporters immediately hailed the law as a model of principled resistance against Washington overreach, arguing that states have not just the right, but the duty to protect citizens from unconstitutional federal actions. Critics warned it would cripple law enforcement cooperation on violent crime investigations and fundamentally violate the supremacy clause that establishes federal law as supreme when it conflicts with state law. The battle lines weren't just drawn, they were fortified with constitutional theory on both sides. What had started as state legislation was rapidly escalating into a Supreme Court confrontation over the limits of federal power and whether states possess any meaningful authority to resist federal mandates they consider unconstitutional. The Department of Justice response came within weeks and was unequivocal. The Biden administration characterized Missouri's law as an open challenge to federal authority that threatened to upend law enforcement cooperation nationwide. Federal prosecutors filed suit arguing the law violated the Constitution's supremacy clause, which establishes that federal law prevails when it conflicts with state law. The government's position was straightforward. States cannot decide independently which federal laws are valid and which aren't. That determination belongs exclusively to federal courts, not state legislatures. The DOJ warned that Missouri's approach would make it dramatically harder for federal agencies to combat violent crime and illegal firearms trafficking because state and local police provide crucial assistance in federal investigations. Missouri's counter-argument was equally clear. The state wasn't claiming authority to invalidate federal law, but rather exercising its sovereign right to refuse spending state resources on enforcing federal laws it believes violate the Constitution. This distinction is crucial because it invokes the anti-commandeering doctrine, a constitutional principle that the federal government cannot force states to enforce federal programs. Missouri argued it was simply declining to participate in federal enforcement, not preventing federal agents from enforcing federal law themselves. This case represented more than disagreement over legal theory. It was a fundamental clash between two competing visions of American federalism: the federal government insisting on uniform nationwide control, versus Missouri asserting that states have duties to protect citizens from what they consider unconstitutional laws. When the case reached federal district court, the judge's decision was swift and devastating for Missouri. The court ruled that the Second Amendment Preservation Act was unconstitutional and issued a comprehensive injunction blocking the entire law from taking effect. In a single ruling, what proponents called the nation's strongest pro-gun state law was completely nullified. The court found the law directly conflicted with the Supremacy Clause, declared that no state could nullify federal law within its borders, and issued an injunction so sweeping it halted every provision of Missouri's statute. For gun owners and state legislators across the country who had been watching Missouri's experiment, the ruling felt like a devastating setback. Missouri's bold attempt had been crushed before it truly began producing any real-world effects. Missouri immediately appealed to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, where hopes were high that appellate judges might view the constitutional questions differently. Missouri's attorneys argued that refusing to enforce certain federal laws didn't interfere with federal authority. It simply exercised the state's constitutional right to determine how state resources would be allocated. The Eighth Circuit panel wasn't persuaded. The three judges ruled unanimously that Missouri's law was unconstitutional, stating explicitly that it purports to invalidate federal statutes and therefore violates the Supremacy Clause. The court emphasized that local police cannot selectively choose which federal laws to follow, and it affirmed the lower court's injunction, keeping the law completely frozen. This unanimous appellate decision represented a major setback, not just for Missouri but for other states that had been considering similar legislation, yet Missouri refused to accept defeat. State leaders filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, asking the justices to intervene and reinstate the law while broader legal challenges continued. When the Supreme Court's order came down, it sent shockwaves through the Second Amendment community for reasons that went beyond the immediate outcome. The justices issued an 8-1 decision denying Missouri's emergency request, with Justice Clarence Thomas as the sole dissenter supporting Missouri's position. The order meant the lower court's injunction would remain in effect while litigation continued. Critically, the justices provided no full opinion explaining their reasoning, signaling they weren't ready to intervene at this preliminary stage, but leaving open the possibility they might revisit the issue once a final decision was reached in lower courts. The reaction split sharply along predictable lines. Many interpreted the 8-1 decision as a crushing defeat, proving Missouri's approach was legally untenable, but others recognized something more nuanced. This was a procedural decision about emergency relief, not a final judgment on whether states can refuse cooperation with federal gun enforcement. The case remained alive in lower courts, and the Supreme Court's silence left the ultimate constitutional question unresolved. Justice Thomas's lone vote in favor of Missouri indicated at least one member of the court believes the federalism issues deserve serious consideration. Then came an unexpected development that complicated the narrative further. When the presidential administration changed, many Second Amendment advocates expected the new leadership would defend Missouri's law aggressively. After all, the president had positioned himself as a strong ally of gun rights, but the Department of Justice under the new administration charted a more cautious course. Rather than fully defending Missouri's law, the DOJ agreed that portions of the previous injunction may have been excessively broad while still supporting fundamental aspects of the lower court's reasoning. The Justice Department indicated it would release some prior judgments when the case returned to district court, but stopped short of fully embracing Missouri's position. This partial reversal left gun rights advocates confused and disappointed, demonstrating how even sympathetic administrations hesitate when cases involve fundamental questions about federal power and constitutional structure. For those who understand how the Supreme Court operates, the 8-1 decision isn't the definitive defeat it superficially appears to be. The justices weren't ruling against Missouri's underlying position, they were declining to intervene at this particular procedural stage. The decision doesn't determine whether the Second Amendment Preservation Act is constitutional. It simply says the court isn't prepared to grant emergency relief while the case develops through normal appellate processes. Justice Thomas's solitary vote signals that at least one member of the court sees merit in revisiting federal overreach questions. The denial keeps the case alive, allowing more evidence and refined legal arguments to develop before potentially reaching the Supreme Court again on a complete record. The impact of Missouri's case extended far beyond its borders, triggering reconsideration nationwide. States like Wyoming, Texas, and Oklahoma began exploring revisions to their own similar legislation, shifting away from nullification language toward anti-commandeering frameworks that focus on refusing state cooperation rather than declaring federal laws invalid. Gun rights organizations began educating legislators on crafting laws that could survive constitutional scrutiny based on lessons from Missouri's experience. Federal agencies conversely took the ruling as validation to challenge similar state initiatives more aggressively. The Missouri fight became a blueprint, not for failure, but for strategic refinement. Every state watching learned where legal boundaries are drawn and how to adjust approaches accordingly. Missouri's legal battle now returns to district court, where the government must decide how much of the original injunction will remain. Missouri may introduce a narrower version focusing purely on anti-commandeering principles rather than broader nullification language. How the current administration's Justice Department handles these proceedings will shape arguments on both sides. Depending on outcomes in district court, the case could return to the 8th Circuit and eventually back to the Supreme Court with a fully developed record. What began as state legislation has evolved into a test case for American federalism and constitutional limits on federal power. Every motion and argument becomes part of a legal roadmap for other states seeking to protect Second Amendment rights through state action. The broader lesson extends beyond Missouri or even gun rights specifically. It illuminates the ongoing constitutional struggle over whether states retain meaningful sovereignty or have been reduced to administrative subdivisions implementing federal mandates. That question remains unresolved, and Missouri's case represents the cutting edge of litigation that will define the balance of power for decades to come.